Welcome back to Full Circle. I'm Hilary Doyle. We live in an era of performance measurement. We track every piece of data we can find for productivity and optimization. But where does recovery sit in these metrics? We often think of recovery as something that happens behind the scenes, with a little self-care and a decent benefits package. But as any elite athlete will tell you, professional recovery isn't optional, it's structural. It's imperative, and it's also really expensive when you get it wrong. So our question is, why do organizations excel at driving performance but find sustaining it that much harder? We want to help you build recovery into your systems without lowering standards or losing your edge. And we have two world-class experts here to help you with solutions. Mona Malone is the CAO and CHRO at BMO Financial Group. And Tessa Virtue is an Olympian, an esteemed figure skater, a 5-time medalist, and an executive advisor with Deloitte. We are delighted to have you here with us today.
Yeah, what a privilege. So happy to be here.
I'll start here. Elite performance environments, I am told, are built around a fairly disciplined cycle of exertion and recovery and calibration. I'm curious, Tessa, about the degree to which you saw that cycle reflected in the leadership of the organizations that you worked for when you were skating.
Well, the thing about amateur athletes is that they're often their own bosses, right? We're hiring coaches. In skating, you're moving to the coach's destination. I spent 10 years in Canton, Michigan. You're putting together your sport service team. And you're doing that when you're 10, 15, 20, 30. I mean, you're kind of learning as you go. So I would not say that it is, at least in figure skating, an ethos that is well structured. I think it takes a lot of time and failure and experience and wisdom to finally come up with a system. I would say I don't think it was until our last 2 years of competing, after 18 years of already competing, that we really found what worked for us. And that was elevated, sophisticated, it was streamlined. We had this incredible team around us, and we were all driving towards this one common goal and doing so in a holistic way. And maybe that's the thing that was missing previously in our career. So when you say what organizations was I working for, I mean, that even that language would have been so foreign to us when we were in the throes of training and chasing, because as an athlete, you're taught to forge ahead and just drive yourself into the ground and suck it up, don't complain, make it look effortless, and just persevere. Those are the things that are rewarded, they're reinforced. You get a lot of validation for being the first one there, the last one to leave. I mean, for the majority of our career, I would say we wore that sort of intense work level as a badge of honor, until we realized that we could do things differently. And I love that intro when you're talking about recovery because it's such a difference maker, but it's not often one that at the outset you prioritize, or maybe we're shifting that narrative, but it's often in response to or in reaction to burnout or injury or some disappointment of some kind. I think it often takes a loss to even consider the fact that you might be operating at less than full capacity.
You're just back from the Olympics. I'm wondering if you're seeing a change of ethos now with the athletes that you're meeting. Is there more of a focus on recovery as part of a holistic training experience?
Absolutely. I think, the thing that athletes have really cracked the code on is handling pressure, and it was so evident at an Olympic Games when, people have just mere seconds to get it right. And, you know, every 4 years, you're kind of chasing this moment on the world's biggest stage. So many factors have to come together in order for things to pan out. You see people rise to the occasion. You see people crumble under that pressure. I think what I'm seeing in the athletic space is this prioritization of the athlete as a whole being, and not just the physical capacity and capability, but also the emotional and mental well-being, really reprioritized.
And that's where there's such a parallel, I think, around leadership excellence more broadly in the corporate environment. We often talk about in BMO, we want people to be at their Olympic best in
Mm.
terms of leadership. And we use that often because it means you can always be getting better and the
Mhm.
bar is raising in terms of what's needed around you. But when you think about then, you're part of a collective system, right? An ecosystem inside of a large organization. And that environment can either help support and accelerate your individual performance and the collective performance or not. And I think the core of your question around, what is it in the systems that help get that kind of Olympic athleticism in more and more of the leaders in a business environment?
We understand, I think, well in business how to achieve our version of an Olympic level mastery. But what I'm curious about in this discussion is where are we falling short on the sustainability piece? Where are we falling short on the recovery piece? We have metrics that measure performance, but do you see any metrics within BMO that could adequately measure recovery in your systems?
First of all, this topic of recovery is really important because organizationally, we want to have an engaged and a high performing culture. And we need high performing leaders in a variety of areas. And we want sustained performance. Like when I think about recovery at an individual level, it's not just self care. So it's recognizing that performance that there's an energy to performance. And so managing your energy is really key. So for us there's a couple things we do. One is purpose is really important. So as an organization, we have a purpose which is called Boldly Grow the Good in Business and Life. And we co-developed our purpose with 6,000 of our employees. And it felt like a bit of an archaeological dig because it was looking back at our history and saying, when were we really at our best? And what were the aspects? And it was about being bold. Um, it was about growth in the community, growth for employees, growth as a bank in terms of growing the organization, recognizing in business and life that banking's very personal. We want employees to be able to show up and recognize, they have lives, they have things that they're trying to do, their personal accomplishments, their career goals. That sense of how do you align people and prioritize on what matters, your goals, because you can't do everything. If an organization's trying to do everything, they end up being mediocre at a whole bunch of things. And so, do you have that clarity of what matters most? Are people empowered to reprioritize at a system and team level as well as at an individual level?
Let's get granular about that then. You two are elite performers in different spaces. And business loves elite performers, loves to center excellence. And so I'm curious about the point at which that centering of excellence tips over into being uh, less a positive and more of a risk. We end up putting a lot of responsibility on high performers. And so those people whose capacity we believe is limitless end up often being the ones to burn out. How do the two of you just measure for this in your own day to day?
Dying to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, at first, I would say it could be small things like before I'm going into a meeting, looking at a few pictures on my phone that really ground me into the things that bring joy. It could be reading affirmations before going into a really tough meeting that ground me in my sense of confidence and who I am, that remind me of when I've done those things and been successful before, so that I'm putting myself in a positive mindset going in. And we talk about these things openly in our culture and encourage people to use these kinds of strategies.
How much of this is an individual pursuit then? And what do you see happening collectively within BMO?
You can take those same approaches and then apply them to the organization. And so if you think about like goal clarity being important for an individual, what are you trying to achieve? Are you ensuring that you have really good organizational alignment mechanisms? And we have on one page our purpose, our values at the bottom, and our four goals. and they apply to everyone, all 50,000 people. And the role of the manager is to align what their team does to that particular page. And so that's a way that we kind of help ground people in everything doesn't matter. This is what matters most. And how do we help channel activity around that? We'll remind people, what have we achieved? Sometimes you think about large change is really daunting, but reminding people what the organization has done before. And our CEO will do that. I'll do that. We'll storytell. Our CFO, when he first came in to his role, um, every quarter, as we announce our results, people would be pulling all nighters. And he came in and he said, my gosh, we've been doing quarterly results since the dawn of time as a 2-century-old bank, and we're going to be for the next few centuries. We need to think about what we do every quarter because this isn't really sustainable, and really went into the granular aspect of how are people doing their work, and realized that by shifting a few aspects of how people were doing work, how work was distributed, the flows of information, that people didn't need to be pulling those kinds of hours in a BAU way, and you could readjust things, which is much more sustainable.
Carry this over into the world of sports in terms of that understanding of cycles of practice, cycles of competition. How critical is it to understand your quarterly results?
I mean, cycles are everything in sport. You mentioned it. Athletes are great at goal setting. And not just that, but breaking down a goal into manageable increments. There was a time in my life when I knew 8 years from now on August 22nd at 2:30, this is exactly what I'm going to be doing. And this is why. This is the functional reason for that. Which was daunting, but also comforting. Life as an athlete is quite simple. There's an objective goal and there's clarity to that. And you have a team of people around you blocking out the distractions, blocking out the noise, telling you have to nap. I mean, it's quite nice. I wish I appreciated it more when when I was in it. But it's the antithesis of your realm, really, when people are pulling you in a million different directions, right? And everyone wants something from you.
But it's almost like great leadership helps your employees perform like elite athletes. You're creating the smoothest ecosystem for them to achieve the goal as possible. And you're identifying that friction and trying to take it away.
Yes, there's such an importance in that adaptability. You set the path. It's like a destination in your GPS, but you're rerouted so many times, and you have to be willing to sort of go with the flow. I think sometimes we can get so entrenched in the work that we fail to stop and pause and pivot and reflect on things. I mean, from an energy standpoint as an athlete, at the end of our career, we measured our sleep patterns, our energy expenditure, our breathing, our brain waves before every training session. Everything was measured. And, I think that's part of why sport is such a beautiful um, thing to draw from, because the highs are high, the lows are low. Everything feels heightened and everything feels so tangible, right? It's maybe not as clear cut in business, although maybe we're getting there. Um, but we knew that we could have 3 hard weeks and we needed 1 recovery week. We knew that every Wednesday needed to be a light day. We could really push Monday, Tuesday, and then Thursday, Friday, Saturday. We were so tuned into that. And in the end, our tendency was to push, push, push. That was just deeply ingrained in us as athletes. And we had people around us to say, actually, it's time to take a breath. And you're going to be better if you retool, if you recover. And I think that accountability was really paramount. The other thing I can't help but bring into this conversation is the mental side of performance. And you talked about confidence. If you're not in control of the mental chatter, when doubt arises, as it inevitably does when there's pressure or stress, if you can't control that and change that narrative, if you can't find the positives, if you can't replay the highlight reel of all the moments that you succeeded, um, I think it's so much harder to step up and flourish in any kind of capacity. And there's something to creating a toolkit of strategies and things that you can actually rely on in the moment.
This is such an important point, because managers need to be able to do that. They want their teams to sign up to higher performance, right? Whether it's, 15 units of this or entering this new market or a deeper relationship with clients. And sometimes what holds them back is that fear aspect of not being able to do it. Sometimes it's a sense of best practices haven't been shared across the organization as fast, and there's a tool or technique over here that you need to port over to this particular part of the organization. But that sense of how do you help people think about what they can achieve that feels scary and daunting, um, but you can get them excited about doing that. That is the role of leadership. That is the role of leadership. And recovery, part of recovery is learning from the past. It's looking at yourself and saying, okay, what are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? How do I need to surround myself? What do I need to do as an individual and then as a team and then an organization? What can I learn from that? And if you can increase your individual, team, and organizational learning, then you increase your performance velocity.
I love the conversation about performance velocity. When you approach your work as a CHRO, are there metrics that you are aware of that indicate a team is starting to burn out, even if the outcomes are still looking positive?
For sure. So the thing about I think athletes and businesses, we measure a lot. So you're looking at turnover, you're looking at short-term disability, long-term disability, you're looking at how often people are absent from work, you're looking at engagement scores, you're looking at high performance, you're looking at the performance variation across workers and what's causing that performance variation. And, if you could shift it a little bit, what that would create for the organization. So all of those things are at the more individual and team level, things that we watch. And then obviously at the organizational level, the efficiency and productivity metrics are really important. I think the other aspect, though, that's more cultural is, do people feel that it's an open culture to talk about what's working and what's not, and what's getting in their way? If you don't have an environment where there's trust between managers and the team and the organizational systems, it's going to be much more difficult to find out.
Tessa, you talk about 18 years in, finally feeling like all of the pieces were fitting together.
We didn't feel like we had this recipe for success. So we retired. And that was after we spent, a good decade of spending sometimes 12, 13, 14-hour days at the rink really consistently. We retired, spent some time away from competition, and then mounted this comeback plan for 2018, which what excited us about that comeback, while the goal didn't change, we wanted to win, it was actually the idea of doing things differently, of coming back and flipping the skating world on its head and thinking about sport differently and approaching every day differently and thinking, what if I wasn't in pain? What if we could actually enjoy the process, not just get locked into that final outcome? Because we knew at that point that's too fleeting to really hang our hats on. What if we could lean into the process? And then we created this whole, you talk about purpose and latching onto that. Beyond the gold medal, it was about, uncovering every bit of potential that we had. And we skated 3 hours a day, totally shifted our thoughts on rest and recovery. Started working with a mental performance coach in a very different way. How could we mentally be strong and ready? And there were a few mindset shifts we made along the way. But ultimately, we ran our skating careers as if we were the CEOs of our business. And it was that autonomy, it was that agency that gave us a sense of joy. And for the first time, I think, probably in my career, I actually loved it. I loved skating. Nothing had changed about my working environment, really. Nothing had changed about the technical requirements or the toxic nature of the sport, but I loved it. And I loved it because I felt like I had ownership of the training, of the material, of the product we put out there. I felt like every time I walked into the doors of the arena, I would ask myself, what do I need to do to make myself proud when I walk back out these doors? And it was more often than not, do the hard thing. Do the thing my competitors weren't willing to do. And that started the cycle of daily, daily wins, setting a small goal, really working tirelessly to achieve it, attaining it, and then recalibrating. And that was addicting. That was exciting. I felt so full of life and so in control. And Mona, I love when you talk about giving your workforce sort of the freedom to take ownership over their day, like how they're going about a task. I think, that in addition to how we reward and recognize those things, those are the things that come into play.
I want to talk about the ways in which you started to see signals um, during your career of when performance was about to degrade, when you might have been on the cusp of an injury. Can you help us scale this for business?
I mean, I was on the operating table twice
Yeah.
because I trained so hard that the fascial tissue around the muscles in my legs would strangulate the muscles if I skated longer than 20 seconds. And were there signs? Probably. Yeah. I was in a lot of pain. But not only was I expected not to acknowledge them, I internalized this like bravado or toughness as a marker of being a good athlete, being a good little soldier, and just doing what I was told when I was told to do it in the way that I was told to do it. And when it was too late, I asked for a third surgery and I was still in so much pain. And it took retirement, it took coming back, it took putting together a totally different team of people, and then recognizing that actually, if I was willing to change my mechanics, if I was willing to think about rest and recovery differently, I actually could skate with a lot less pain. Part of that was the science-based approach, but another part of that was trusting it. So often, at least for me, I never realized I was on the brink of burnout until it was too late. And so eventually I required the systems and the team around me and the data to show my levels of fatigue, to show that, I actually needed a bit of rest here and there, blah, blah, blah. But but it's so cumulative, like for us, what decisions we made in August would affect us in February. And that was a really delicate balance. I will highlight again back to the mental performance of some of this that plays into the physical output. We needed to stop chasing perfection and instead pursue excellence. And that's a word that you've used a lot. Letting go of perfection was complicated and nuanced, but really liberating because it meant we could skate freely and it meant that we could give ourselves to training in a very different way without that pressure of this thing that was unattainable, actually. And also the use of visualization, which, from the time I was 10, I was working with sports psychologists teaching me how to visualize. And Dane Jensen, who's a resilience expert, often talks about this. When you become adept at visualizing, your body gets 85% of the benefit. And so if I have a highlight reel on in my head, my body is getting the dopamine, it's getting the hit of serotonin. I'm reliving that and I'm feeling it physically. That is manifesting, but I'm actually saving myself physiologically. But if I'm ruminating on a failure, on a disappointment, my body also doesn't know the difference. I mean, talk about energy management. If we're not in control of that, if we can't toggle that back and forth, we're losing a lot of that energy. And that comes into play when we're talking about confidence, when we're talking about this ability to walk into a boardroom with swagger, with a sense of real purpose, and with this posture and knowledge of real evidence-based kind of history and experience of performing when it matters. I think the visualization piece and the sort of managing that mental chatter, those things are huge.
Exactly. And decision quality for sure. I often find just activity. People are so busy doing that there isn't as much thinking time. And so if you see people really busy, back to back to back meetings, feeling kind of almost exasperated, and that becomes the water cooler conversation about how busy things are or how many meetings there like that tells you, hold on, something's not working here, because that sense of thinking time, creativity, connection, really important parts. Ensuring that you have that sense of learning, and the learning is the reflection and the individual learning and organizational learning. If that's not happening, you're going to repeat mistakes. That thinking time in an organization is extremely important. We actually took 6 months and did a pretty hard review of what worked, what didn't work, including his own reflections of what worked as CEO. What are the things I need to do differently for the next 5 years? And and then his ability to sit with us as a leadership team and talk about that really openly, and then encouraging us to do the same with our teams.
Tessa, I would love to know how business leaders should treat employees like yourself, elite performers who will come into any organization and drive until they're injured. What is one piece of advice that you would give to leaders nurturing elite talent within their organization to help keep them safe, to help keep them healthy?
Hmm. What a great question. I think we have to be conscious of how we train people to signal value to their superiors and what we recognize and reward, especially in the context of this conversation with recovery, because I think that is one of the things that drives behaviors um, that don't serve us sometimes.
If you're rewarding Herculean efforts all the time or the hours in, that reinforces that. If you're really rewarding like problem solving, collaboration, outputs, that can help manage that. But it's such an important thing. I think the other aspect is recognizing and having a conversation when you have a super high performer that will drive themselves through a wall to get an outcome. Just really saying, I need your performance, and you're a member of this team, not just today, this week, but going forward.
I spent about 20 years getting feedback every 30 seconds. Someone was telling me how to improve, what I could do better. It was always constructive criticism, we'll say. But there was no gray area. I knew where I was, I knew where I wanted to go, and I knew exactly how to bridge that gap. And while that was a lot, and sometimes hard to manage some negativity, it was also really addicting. And when I launched myself into the business realm, I realized the annual performance review just wasn't going to cut it. I crave feedback. And so the thing that's on my mind at the moment is just framing, from a culture perspective, framing feedback as a gift and creating teams and departments and organizations that give and receive feedback, knowing that you're chasing the same goal. You have this shared vision. There's no better way to get there than through some candor. And feedback is always best received when it comes from someone who you believe is your champion and who believes in you. So that requires good leadership.
I want to thank you both for your Herculean effort in this podcast. What a pleasure to sit with you both. Mona Malone, Tessa Virtue, thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been fantastic.
Here's the takeaway. Recovery isn't earned after performance. It's what makes sustained performance possible. Where is recovery being built into your systems, and where is it being quietly assumed? Because centering recovery is not only good for employee morale, culture, and retention, it also happens to be one of the most sustainable cost reduction measures you can take. So thank you again to Tessa Virtue and Mona Malone for being with us, and thanks to you for listening and now watching. As always, we'd love to hear from you. Please email us at circleback@deloitte.ca and follow Full Circle wherever you get your podcasts. Other than that, take a load off, relax, recover. You've earned it. Thanks for being with us.